do you find yourself speaking with friendly audiences who are ready to hear the message of Mars, or is it people who aren't really aware of it? Is it a surprise to them?
I speak to both audiences of people who know a lot about the Mars exploration program and people who know almost nothing. But the latter group are certainly friendly, that they may not be knowledgeable, but they're curious. They want to find out. This is something that people find interesting, and it's something that people support. I very rarely get a significant number of people who say, why bother with this? Instead, what I do get from the outsiders is, why aren't we doing this? This is the sort of thing this country ought to be doing.
Well, you, I think, touched on that in your opening remarks, but what is your answer to that? Why aren't we? Why aren't we on Mars today?
Well, the reason why we're not on Mars today is because of a massive failure in political leadership on the part of the Nixon administration, which aborted the Apollo program, which wanted to continue after the initial moon landings with building a moon base by the late 70s and human missions to Mars by the early 80s and human bases on Mars by the late 80s. That was the program, and that was killed. And we've never really recovered from that, but we're starting to recover in a new way. That is, with the degeneration of the political class and the kind of leadership it can offer, a new group of leaders has emerged, and this is the entrepreneurial.
The private space.
Yes, the entrepreneurial space initiatives. This is something that, you know, in the 70s, people just thought, well, this is an aberration. As soon as we get some other people in here, this will get back on track. And then in the 80s, Reagan attempted to, but by then the thing was a partisan issue, and whereas Apollo was bipartisan, and everybody supported it. Now it was fragmented, and so people started talking. Maybe we need private space initiatives, and by the 90s, patience had kind of worn thin in a lot of quarters. People saying we definitely need private initiatives because the government just isn't doing this. And initially, I mean, there were a number of attempts, but they were undercapitalized, and so they were failures. But finally, we had people throw their hat into it who had substantial financial resources, like Musk, Bezos.
At the rise of the billionaires, there
Right.
weren't many billionaires back in the 80s, and so finding a billionaire who also had an interest in space was
Right.
a unicorn.
Well, true. But what happened is as a result of the success of SpaceX in particular, that it became possible for people who weren't billionaires to find investors. Because, in other words, this idea that you could have a private launch company seemed fantastical to most people in the 80s and 90s, but then, Musk started SpaceX in 2002, and initially people laughed at him as well. Mm-hmm. But in around 2008 or so, they succeeded in getting the Falcon 1 to orbit. It became less of a joke. And then when they got the Falcon 9 to orbit circa 2010 and now had a serious commercial launch vehicle, then the laughing stopped.
Well, and I remember the day that they stuck the landing on that Falcon. I was like, that changed the world right there.
Right. Well, then that was a further advance. That's 2015. Yeah. But in showing that it is possible for an entrepreneurial space organization to do things that previously was thought that only the governments of superpowers could do, and not only that, do it in 1/10 the cost and 1/3 the time, and then do things that they had not been able or even thought possible to do, like reusable space vehicles. That opened it up, so now you have people like Rocket Lab, which was not founded by a billionaire, it was founded by a working engineer who then found investors, and then there's quite a number of these other companies that are coming up relatively.
I think Rocket Lab is here at the conference, or am I?
Yes, Rocket Lab. Peter Beck, the CEO of Rocket Lab, spoke at the conference yesterday.
Oh, okay.
And what they're doing is very impressive. And right now, they already have reached orbit. They're sending probes to Venus, and they will have a launch vehicle that will be quite competitive against the Falcon 9 within about a year or two. Now, of course, SpaceX is trying to stay ahead of that by creating a launch vehicle significantly superior to a Falcon 9. But actually, in terms of the established space companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, none of them have a vehicle either in operation or prospectively in operation that approaches a Falcon 9.
What are they doing these days? And are they just completely out of the space thing,
No,
or
they're
just
not.
The military space.
Well, there's military space, but Musk is also taking a significant fraction of military space. However, the military, for good reasons, do not want to be completely dependent on Elon Musk or any other single company. So while there definitely is a case for the military to buy a good fraction of their launches from SpaceX, it is the most economical launch. It is also the case that they, for good reasons, want to keep in business, in the launch business, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and will undoubtedly want to keep Rocket Lab in business as well once it offers a serious capability. They definitely need a competitive landscape.
Do you think that the science in space travel is going to prosper under private enterprise, or would that be more of a altruistic goal of government, whereas maybe the private space is looking for the direct monetary payback on it?
Well, first of all, what the private space has already done for the science program is lowered its launch costs.
Yes. Yeah.
A lot. And for instance, the TESS Space Telescope, which is in interplanetary orbit, it's a planet finder. Okay, it was launched on a Falcon 9. And therefore the science directorate only had to spend $70 million on a launch instead of $200. And so that saved them $130 million that they could spend on science.
That's not chump change.
No, it is not. So simply the fact that the commercial space is offering cheaper launches is greatly helping the science program. Now, Rocket Lab's mission to Venus is being privately funded. It's not funded by NASA. It's privately funded. They've created a launch vehicle that's so cheap, about $7.5 million. $7.5 million to send a small probe to Venus. That's a small probe. It's only about 40 kilograms, but that's enough to do its mission.
Yeah. Is that intended to land on Venus by any chance?
Well, it will, but by the time it does, it will be destroyed. It's going to come down through the atmosphere slowly because the atmosphere is dense, and it'll take measurements on its way down. So it's really an atmospheric probe. But the atmosphere on Venus is really the most interesting thing. That's where people think there could be evidence of aerial microbial life. That's a very controversial claim, but they're going to investigate it.
Yeah, that's the way to do it then, is investigate and find out, and not just...
That's right. And that's a privately funded mission. Now, so the launch is $7.5 million. Perhaps the full cost of the mission is $15 million. That is, a factor of 10 cheaper than the cheapest NASA planetary mission, and a factor of 100 cheaper than some of its flagship planetary missions. So if you're a private donor, well, there are some private donors who could donate $1 billion,
Sure.
but there's a hell of a lot more that can do $15 million.
Mm-hmm.
And so by making this cheap, it's possible now for private parties. There are certainly corporations that could afford a $15 million planetary mission. There are certainly universities that could afford a $15 million planetary mission. I'm sure this building here that we're in right now costs more than $15 million.
Certainly.
And it was almost certainly built by a donation from someone. And so there's plenty of such things that there are people willing to spend that kind of money for things that are not necessarily for profit. that are being done for the benefit of the public. Certainly, any number of hospitals have been built by private donors for that kind of money, but not just hospitals, things that are less convincing as a social benefit, if you will, including sports stadiums, opera houses, and so forth. So, philanthropy occurs at all levels, and by making it possible to do planetary missions for tens of millions of dollars instead of hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, it certainly opens things up in terms of private planetary missions, private space telescopes, things of this sort. The Keck family has funded a number of observatories, including here in Arizona, the Keck telescopes. And astronomy for a long time has been funded by private foundations. It's the kind of money that they have can support major astronomical observatories. And, the same kind of people can now fund planetary missions or space telescopes.
Do you think it falls to the space advocacy community, Mars Society, Planetary Society, some of the other groups, to make that type of scientific philanthropy fashionable?
Well, it's certainly
desirable, maybe a better
certainly
word?
Useful. I mean, look, the Mars Society does three things, really. One is public outreach to spread the vision. Second is political work to try to defend and expand the Mars programs done by the governments. And the third is private projects of our own, of which the most important have been the Mars stations and also the Mars rover contests. Okay. Now, the latter are both funded, have been funded significantly by donors. Some of the funding has come from the crew members themselves in the stations too. But the stations were, the operating funds typically comes from the crews, but the stations were built with donor money. So, yeah, we certainly have encouraged space philanthropy because we're one of the recipients of it. But and we've done a number of accomplishments in the political arena too. But actually, I think our most important accomplishments have been in the first area, the spreading the vision, even though it's the least quantifiable. In other words, I can tell you we've had 1,500 crew members in the Mars Desert Research Station, and given the 250 crews, 6 people each, so forth. I can give you quantitative metrics on how many people participated in our rover contest. But this is much harder. Billions of people have read stories about us or our stations or the rover contests or me just commenting on policy. And it's had a certain influence. We had a major influence in recruiting Elon Musk to make Mars his calling, and as well as many of the other important people at SpaceX. So actually, there wouldn't be a SpaceX if not for our activity in spreading the vision. And who knows? There's dozens of other new companies being formed by people who were influenced to make this their calling through our activity. And some policy decisions that will be favorable to them will be done by people in the government who've been influenced to share the vision. And some breakthroughs will be done by engineers, passionate, capable people who decided to make this their thing because we spread the vision. Victor Hugo, great French writer, he's the one who wrote "Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come." And that is true provided the idea has messengers that can spread it. And so, that's our role. We're working for Victor Hugo. And so, yes, and certainly by spreading the vision, we'll encourage people to want to do privately funded Mars missions. and ultimately, I believe, privately funded Mars settlement. I think it's going to happen. And someday there will be Mars settlements, and they'll certainly want to have a home front organization that can both get policies here that are favorable to them and even donors. Okay. No, so if you can go somewhere and make a fortune because you're taking over a place with diamond mines, you don't need a home front organization. Okay. But if you're going to create a civilization that might not turn a profit for quite some time, eventually it will. Okay, because people will figure out how to make it work once they're there. But this kind of thing, this kind of enterprise, which is based on ideas rather than profit, typically does need a home front organization. I'm looking forward to the day when the Mars Society will transition from being an advocacy organization to being a home front organization supporting the colonies on Mars. I'd be willing to go to Mars. Certainly, if it was a condition for Mars happening, I would go to Mars. Okay.
If it was a one-way trip?
Yes. I would. But that's not my motivation. Okay. That is, there are people who are in the space advocacy movement because what they really want is to be able to go to space, to be on orbit, to look out the window and see the stars and float around the cabin in zero-G. Okay. Now, I would not turn that down. Okay. But I would definitely take it. Say, so you want to ride on a Dragon? Are you willing to spend 6 months on the space station? Well, sure. Okay. But that's not why I've devoted my life to space. Okay. I'm doing it because I think it's important. I think that it's the most important thing that's happening in this period of human history. I believe that, assuming that humanity is successful, we don't blow ourselves up or something, that when people look back at this time, this is what people will consider significant. Okay? That is, this time will be remembered because this is when we first set sail for other worlds. And once again, while you can certainly make critiques of Christopher Columbus, we remember Christopher Columbus. Okay? We don't resemble a horde of other people who were much more big-time operators at that time. Whether they were nicer or meaner than him, and they were both. We remember Queen Isabella because she sponsored him. Can anyone remember who was Queen of Spain after her? Even though that Spain was a far more rich and powerful Spain than the one that Isabella was queen of. Okay? No, nobody knows that. 1492, what happened in 1492? Columbus sailed. A lot of other things happened. The Borgias took over the papacy in 1492, the most powerful political institution in the world at that time. Okay? How many people know that today? England and France signed a peace treaty in 1492. Yeah. If the Washington Post had been published in 1492, those would have been the two stories, right? Now, Italian weaver's son sails some boats off somewhere and brings back some odd-looking people and some strange fruits. No. So we remember that. That is what's significant. Just all the wars and coups and takeovers and and scandals of the year 1492 that would have loomed large in 1492 are forgotten to us today. Columbus is remembered because he opened up the New World. And once again, make Columbus was a nasty character and so forth, and that's true. But nevertheless, the thing that differentiated him from all the other nasty characters that abounded in the year 1492, okay, is that he opened up a new world. And and once again, we can do this ourselves without the negative side of it.
Towards the things that you're saying here, if we're going to, as a space advocacy community, continue to push for this, what aren't we doing that we should be? What's the trick we're missing? What's the best thing that we could get going?
That's interesting. Once again, I think it's all in spreading the message. The place where I'd really like to penetrate, which it seems odd because it's a place where on a superficial basis we've penetrated a long time ago, but we haven't, is Hollywood. That is, the dominant art form in our society today is film. Okay? Painting, sculpture, and poetry have insignificant audiences. Live theater, very small. Novels are read, but even, the Tom Clancy bestseller that sells 2 million copies is insignificant if a movie flop does 20 million views. Okay? And a successful movie, like Titanic or something, is 1 billion views.
Well, The Martian did really well.
Yeah, The Martian.
But that stood out among...
Right. Now, The Martian, you see, was a good movie, but it wasn't a great movie. It wasn't the movie we really need. Not at all. The Martian was a story of human fortitude, and can-do spirit, and so forth. But it didn't convey the vision of Mars. The Matt Damon character wasn't interested in Mars. He wasn't interested in either the search for life on Mars or the human future on Mars. He was just interested in going home. So fundamentally, it was, as it were, an aviation story.
It's about anti-Mars.
Well,
Keep me away.
Well, okay, it didn't make a propaganda case against Mars, but it's just like, here we are in peril, whether in the air or on the sea or someplace like this, and how do we save the ship and get home alive? Okay, so a positive story about the human spirit, but not about Mars. Okay, it didn't spread the vision of Mars. Okay,
you were in a Netflix series.
Right, done by National Geographic.
Yeah.
All right, and I had some input, but it was limited.
And that still was talking about landing on Mars and not the vision for what it could be.
Right. Now, we had some interesting interchanges on that show, and some of it made it through the editorial process and actually got onto the screen. But it didn't really convey this vision. In an odd way, Star Trek conveys the vision better, especially the original series. The idea of a positive human future based on being a spacefaring future. So actually Star Trek did convey that broad vision, but of course it didn't address Mars in particular at all. Because Mars is the key to get from here to the Star Trek future.
Yeah, we won't develop warp drive until we have a need for warp drive,
Right.
something to get us back and forth to Mars in minutes rather than months.
Right, or at least weeks rather than
No.
months. Okay. But yes, precisely. Columbus sailed the ocean, the Atlantic, in ships that even 50 years later no one would have crossed the Atlantic in. Because until European civilization became transatlantic in character, there was no need to develop ocean-going ships. So he did it in ships that were appropriate for the Mediterranean or for coastal traffic in Europe, but not for crossing oceans. Okay, but 50 years after Columbus, there are 3-masted sailing ships that are quite competent to crossing oceans, and then they get better. in the great age of sail, and clipper ships, and then steamboats and ocean liners, and eventually Boeing 747s, and of course the airplanes that now make crossing the world an easy activity, were invented here. That is, if Columbus had waited for the 747, he would have waited forever, not just for 400 or 500 years, because the people who invented the airplane came out of the new world that he made possible by daring it in primitive ships.
You don't advance by waiting for a technology to be complete and then using it. You advance with
what you have.
You go to war with the army you got.
Yeah, right.
It's like the 747 wasn't built for the scientists, it was built for the people who wanted to cross the ocean quickly.
But
right.
You can use it to study hurricanes.
Yes.
And, and you can use it to take food to people who need it, or
right.
you can use it to...
But only after it's been used to transport masses of people.
Right, but, but to get back, I mean, actually, get a little, not that close to Columbus' time, but significantly closer. Okay, the more advanced sailing ships were made to make transatlantic and trans-Pacific travel possible. Okay, and then the steamboat, okay, is the first great American invention. Okay, the British invented the steam engine. Okay, and they were using it to pump water out of mines. Okay, the steamboat was actually an American invention, and because the early America didn't have highways, the highways we had were rivers, and a sailboat can't really cut it very well on rivers, because the river is always going this way, and you may have wind or you may not have wind, and this and that. It's a much tougher navigation problem than, if you're at sea, you go so far with the wind. If the wind stops, you stay there, but the wind picks up, you keep going. Okay, in a river, no. Okay, so we invented the steamboat, and when we invented the steamboat, it involved creating steam engines, high pressure engines that were much more efficient than the Watt engines. And then the next advance was the railroads, the locomotives, which were even more efficient. And that was a British invention based on our invention. But then America is the one who really took railroads big time. Okay, by 1850, American railroads was more track here than in the whole rest of the world combined.
Because we needed it. We had the big, huge thing that required that transportation. If we had stopped at the Appalachians, we might not have, had a genocide going west, but we also wouldn't have had railroads in any real way because we had a much smaller thing that horses worked fine for.
Right, exactly. And continental nation need railroads. And of course, when you're building railroads, you're creating an entire cadre of tinkerers and engineers, whether formally educated or not, who are then going to create a whole industrial revolution, and did.
Yeah. I think it really stuck with me last night. Somebody asked one of the panel sessions on Manifest Destiny, and I don't think you shied away at all from the blood that we spilled expanding west, but you ended it up with we can take Mars with clean hands.
That's right.
Blood does not actually come to it, and that to me it's a frontier you can get behind without qualification.
That's right. It's an act of pure creation.
How many of those have we had in our human history?
Very few.
Yeah.
Very few. And so, and it shows you can create without stealing from someone else or destroying someone else. Okay? And in fact, you can create much more than is practical to try to steal from someone else. And once again, that there's no reason killing each other, fighting over provinces, when working together we can create planets.
Yeah. There was another phrase before the Industrial Revolution that scarcity had to be planned against. Now it has to be enforced. That the resources we have now could amply cover everybody's needs, but there's interest on a lot of levels of keeping people hungry or keeping people at your beck and call, so that but if we start to expand into a spacefaring civilization, I think that's going to just push and push and push against that, because the resources, the way we develop things, the way we can look at the planet in a new way, it will break that enforcement of scarcity, or it certainly can, and take us to the Star Trek future. Let me ask you, because you said we needed to drop it down here, let's go ahead and bring it to close. I did want to ask you one particular thing, is if you had to pick a date and had to pick a group, who is going to put us on Mars and when? Is it SpaceX? Is it a government? Is it the Chinese? Is it?
I think, and I'm not that into prediction because I don't believe the future is predictable.
I know, but it's a fun
I
question.
I don't believe in destiny. I believe people make their future. I think if Musk disciplines himself so that he doesn't skate off the edge of the ice, okay? Because his most formidable enemy is himself. He's a very formidable person, and I think if he gets his act together, disciplines himself, the team he has assembled is so brilliant that I believe that Starship will be reaching orbit in an operational way in 2024. We'll have someone be elected in 2024. They'll say, look, these guys want to go to Mars. If we got together with them, could we get there by the end of my second term? The answer is going to be yes. Will it cost $1 trillion? The answer is no. We can do it within NASA's existing budget. It just needs some extra stuff that he's not working on. Let's get together with him. Let's do this. And that's how it'll be done. I think it will be done by NASA teaming with SpaceX. Now, there's a lot of other ways this could go. This is not. But this, I think, is a real possibility, and if the people who could make it happen do what is necessary, it will happen.
I think you brought up a really good time constraint on it, the end of the second term.
Yes.
Yeah, that's that's a very realistic limit on it, and yeah, because nobody's going to get it 90% of the way there and then leave it to their predecessor.
Right.
But on that cheery note, I
Okay.
think we can close out. Thank you.